Hello everybody, welcome back to another Biology of Cells and Tissues video. We're going to continue with our journey through the endocrine gland. As always, please leave a like on the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and of course leave comments if you have any questions, and I will get to them as soon as I can. Okay, we left off finishing the pituitary gland. Now we're going to continue down. We're talking about the thyroid gland. The pituitary gland, the pituitary whole situation was a lot of the meat of this lecture, so we're going to be rolling a little bit quicker from here on out. So the thyroid gland is a highly vascular, butterfly-shaped gland that surrounds the anterior surface of the trachea, just below the larynx. So if you have a guy and you have an Adam's apple, you can feel right there. That's the Adam's apple, right there. That's what you're feeling. Some of that cartilage. Just below that, kind of right above your collarbones, that is going to be where your thyroid gland sits. You typically have two lobes. You have a right lobe and a left lobe. There's an additional lobe that's called the pyramidal lobe. This is found in about 55% of the entire population, mostly in males when compared to females. And we don't add it here. You'll talk about this a little bit in anatomy, and when you start doing dissections, you may actually see this lobe. So the two lobes are connected in the middle by what is called the isthmus. I don't know whoever came up with that word very much dislikes people with lisps. The isthmus. And as well, there is a connective tissue capsule. So essentially there is a connective tissue that just surrounds the whole thing, kind of protecting the thyroid gland. There are two main structures that make up the thyroid gland. We have follicles, which are made up of follicular cells, as well as a substance called colloid. And then we also have parafollicular cells, which are also known as C cells. Starting with the follicles. The follicles, these are the structural as well as the functional units of the thyroid gland. We think, what does the thyroid gland do? It's going to make thyroid hormone. The follicles are made up of follicular cells and the colloid. So right here, each of these circles, these are the follicles. And the follicular cells are these simple cuboid epithelium that surrounds each of these follicles. The inside jelly-looking stuff, that is colloid, which contains a gelatinous protein called thyroglobulin. The thyroglobulin is what is going to become the thyroid hormone. And just an extra little fun tidbit, the thyroid gland is actually the only endocrine gland to store its secretions so that it makes them ahead of time and then stores them until their release. I say only one that stores, now realizing like this is there's the kind of the technicality side of things where yes, the posterior pituitary does store the hormone, those other hormones, but the thyroid one is one that it's because it makes it. The posterior pituitary doesn't make it. I should say the thyroid gland is the only endocrine gland to produce and store its own secretions ahead of time. Okay. The other part of the thyroid gland are the parafollicular cells, also known as C cells. They are called C cells because they produce the hormone calcitonin. The job of calcitonin is to lower blood calcium. So if our calcium levels are way too high, that can cause issues, especially in our muscles and especially in our heart, because our heart is just one big muscle. So we really need to make sure that our calcium levels stay perfectly balanced. The way that calcitonin lowers the blood calcium. It inhibits osteoclast cells and stimulates osteoblast cells. If you remember back, osteoblasts, blasts build, clasts break it down. So we stop bone from being broken down and we stimulate bone building. We also decrease the amount of calcium that we're reabsorbing in the kidney. Calcitonin does all of those things. The follicular hormones, the thyroid hormones that we make thyroxine, which is T4, and we make, let me do this. It's thyroid hormone, which comes in a T4 and T3 form. T4, thyroxine, is the inactive form, but makes up 90% of what we make. And then the triiodothyronine, T3, is the active form, which is about 10% of what we make. We do this because the T4 form is actually more stable. And so what we do is we send it off to the cells, whatever cells it needs to work on. And then inside of those cells, it can turn it from T4 into T3. And the job of thyroid hormone is to stimulate the metabolic rate. So something like if we're really, really cold, we might get an uptick in thyroid hormone release to help increase our metabolic rate to help us stay warm. If you've ever gone into like the rabbit hole of ice baths, saunas, that kind of stuff, this is where a lot of that focus kind of is talking about hormone levels and how shocking your body in the different extremes affects those hormone levels. The parafollicular cells, I already dove into that a little bit. It's the calcitonin, which lowers the blood calcium levels by inhibiting bone resorption. So this word always kind of bothered me. So I'm going to make sure I explain it. Bone resorption, it's saying that you're reabsorbing the minerals that are in the bone. If we think way back to the bone lecture, we would produce the cartilage cells, the hyaline cartilage cells, and then those cartilage cells would essentially keep growing, and then they would die, and then we would replace them with osteocytes, and we would calcify all of that. So that was kind of putting it all down, and the resorption or reabsorption part of it would be breaking it down and reabsorbing it into the blood. I don't usually like that, the way that that's worded, but oftentimes that's the way they like to test it, is using that kind of word. And yeah, so that's our thyroid gland. We have our negative feedback loop here. The hypothalamus, so let's say we need thyroid hormone. The hypothalamus is going to release thyrotropin releasing hormone, and that goes down to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then releases thyroid stimulating hormone, which then that travels through the blood and gets to the thyroid itself. And then the thyroid produces the thyroid hormone, that T3 and T4. And with the T3 and T4 released into the blood, it circulates through the blood, makes it back up to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sees, okay, we've got thyroid hormone, we're good. And then it stops secreting, and it kind of turns off the hypothalamus, and it stops secreting the thyrotropin releasing hormone. Next part, parathyroid gland. These are two paired nodules, 4 small nodules, 2 pairs, that are embedded in the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. So they're hidden back behind the thyroid. They are made up of what we call cords of cells, chief, also known as principal cells, and then oxyphil cells. They call them cords because if you zoom in with a microscope way, way close onto them, they kind of have like this string-like, you can kind of see like this string cord-like structure That's why they call them cords. So here's our thyroid gland. You can see all of the follicles, and then embedded, that is our parathyroid gland. The job of the parathyroid gland is essentially the opposite of the calcitonin of the parafollicular cells. So that's kind of paired, thyroid, parathyroid, they're right there. The chief cells secrete parathyroid hormone, which increases blood level calcium. So calcitonin from the thyroid decreases blood calcium, parathyroid increases blood calcium. And it does the opposite things. It increases the number and stimulates osteoclast activities. Calcitonin inhibited those. And then parathyroid is also going to decrease the blood level of phosphate through the kidneys. It's going to tell the kidneys to dump phosphate. This is because phosphate likes to bind to calcium, and it forms a salt. And when it's bound to that calcium in the salt form, the calcium can't be used. So by getting rid of the phosphates, we have more free calcium in the blood. And these are completely regulated by blood calcium levels. It keeps an eye on the blood calcium and then enacts accordingly. Next, oxyphil cells. As far as we know, there's no known function. The best thinking is that they may be degenerative or inactive chief cells, because we do tend to see more of them as the patient ages, as we in general age, but we really don't know the function of the oxyphil cells. Here are our pictures. The nice bright ones are our chief cells. The little darker, the larger pink ones, lighter pink ones, those are our oxyphil cells. Next, the thymus. So we covered the thymus already. That was all in the lymphatic system lectures. What I did is I went ahead and included all of the thymus slides here in the notes. We're not going to go over it now. If you want a refresher on the thymus, you can jump back and watch the lymphatics video. And I included them here as well. Of course, all my notes are available to get an electronic copy. You can look in the description below. There's a link for that. So skipping the thymus, moving on to the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland, this is another one I really, really, really want everybody to focus and pay attention on, because this is going to come back so much. You're never going to hear the end of the adrenal gland through the entire time that you're in this program, and even after this. Okay? This is a paired gland that are superior to the kidney. Their AKA is suprarenal gland. Supra, above, renal, the kidney gland. And it's really two glands in one. You have the outer portion is the cortex, and the inner portion is the medulla. We're going to start by talking about the cortex. You can see here, outer portion, take a slice. We have the cortex, is all this part, and the medulla is the inside. The cortex is derived from mesoderm. Easy test question right there, I promise. And the adrenal gland synthesizes and secretes hormones only on demand. There are 3 layers. The outermost layer is the zona glomerulosa. It's about 15% of the cortex. The zona fasciculata is the largest at 78% of the cortex. And then the zona reticularis is about 7% of the cortex. We're going to break each of these down individually. Adrenal cortex, that is the outermost layer. This produces and secretes mineralocorticoids. The one specific one that it does is aldosterone. We remember aldosterone from the kidneys. When we talked about aldosterone, it does the balancing of sodium. It goes to the distal convoluted tubule to help pull sodium back into the blood, and that's controlled by the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. So remember, aldosterone deals with sodium. Sodium is a mineral. So aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid. I threw this little note in here because the professor whose slides I used for the base of this specifically said that there is no involvement of the adrenocorticotropic hormone to stimulate this. And while it's primarily regulated by the renin angiotensin system, there still is some effect coming from the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and everything else up there. So depending on your professor, if you get this specific question, what I say is if you know more than what was taught and then you can articulate that and explain that, no professor is ever going to punish you for knowing things at a deeper level. So that's what I have to say about that. The zona fasciculata, this secretes glucocorticoids. I'm going to highlight these because we need to know the names. Glucocorticoids, specifically cortisol. You might also see, like, they might talk about cortisone as well. Cortisone might be another one that they mention, but less likely that they mention that one. I'm going to make it smaller because it's not as important. Cortisol, we've mentioned cortisol a couple times before. This is our stress hormone. Its job is to regulate blood sugar during periods of stress. It's part of our fight or flight response in prepping the body for in case we need to fight or flight. It also depresses the immune system and depresses the inflammatory response, which is why typically after high stress situations like finals week, you tend to come down with some kind of sniffles, or you get a little bit sick because it depresses your immune system. And this very much is controlled by our adrenocorticotropic hormone, that ACTH, released from the anterior pituitary. So right here, the hypothalamus releases CRH. This is corticotropic releasing hormone. You'll notice most of the hormones coming from the hypothalamus are releasing hormones, and then the ones released from the pituitary tend to be the stimulating or something like that hormone. So yeah, the hypothalamus, the antipituitary, adrenal, then we get more cortisol in the plasma, and it goes back and it cuts off and does the negative feedback. Now, the zona reticularis, this is the deepest layer of the cortex. It secretes gonadocorticoids, which are this big long name, dihydroepiandrosterone, shortened to DHEA. This is the gonadocorticoids. These are our sex hormones. So right there, gonadocorticoids, gonads, sex hormones. These are the ones that DHEA is actually going to travel through the blood and go to either the testes in the male or the ovaries in the female and turn into testosterone for males or estrogen for females. It's also sometimes called an androgen. So if you see androgen, that word that means sex hormone, so that can be used in place of DHEA. Really, we don't make a ton of this for males, especially because the testes do most of this instead. And this is also regulated by the ACTH hormone from the anterior pituitary. The adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is really cool because it's actually more of nervous cell type tissue than it is. It's more like nervous tissue than it is like hormones. So it's derived from the neural crest cells. It's the innermost portion of the adrenal gland, and it functions as part of the endocrine system as well as part of the sympathetic nervous system. It is a modified sympathetic ganglion. If we remember, think back, I know that we talked about this at one point, but the sympathetic nervous system, part of that autonomic nervous system, ganglions are a collection of neuron cell bodies located in the peripheral nervous system. So with the sympathetic nervous system, we have what's called a sympathetic chain, which runs throughout kind of the lower cervical through the thoracic spine. That's where all of these are located. This is a special one because it's actually outside of that, which is why it's called that modified one. And it contains these special cells called chromaffin cells. Chromaffin cells produce and secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are known, kind of their classification are catecholamines. So if we talk about catecholamines, that's what we're talking about, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And I believe we've mentioned this before, but epinephrine and norepinephrine are special because they are both neurotransmitters and hormones. So we use epinephrine a lot in like our actual neurons communicating with each other, but we also use it here as a hormone that circulates through the body. The AKA for epinephrine is adrenaline. That we've probably heard about more. Norepinephrine is noradrenaline. Both of these do similar jobs. They're both part of that sympathetic response, that fight or flight, that increase heart rate, increase breathing, tighten the muscles, increase blood flow, get prepared. The difference is on what kind of receptors that they act on. Don't worry about receptors right now. In a couple of trimesters, you'll start to talk about receptors, beta receptors, alpha receptors, and what those are and what they do. So I just wanted to include it here so you see it once. You'll talk about that further on in the future, though. The adrenal medulla is regulated by preganglionic sympathetic neurons. I'm going to explain what that I mean by that. So as I mentioned way earlier when we talked about the hypothalamus, that autonomic nervous system is controlled by the hypothalamus. So when our sympathetic nervous system is activated, there are neurons that run from the hypothalamus through the entire spinal cord, through these nerves that are called splanchnic nerves, and then that go and make it to the adrenal medulla, and then they synapse inside of the adrenal medulla. So preganglionic sympathetic neurons from the hypothalamus. So imagine a neuron starting in the hypothalamus up here in your brain, running all the way down your spinal cord, and then popping out to then insert. Think, where do nerves enter into into all this? So the nerve enters into the adrenal gland and goes and it synapses inside of the cortex. That to me is just really, really cool that we have that vast connection. You can just see how interconnected the entire nervous system is. And that's where we get the stimulation to have the response of releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. Cool. This is a little bit more detail than you need. You want to remember preganglionic sympathetic neurons, but I wanted to take it a step further because you will talk about this eventually in future courses as well. So Here's just some pictures of the adrenal gland, what these all look like. These are good to study for your lab portion of the exam. Teachers love to ask about the adrenal cortex. You will always, always, always get questions on the adrenal cortex, knowing what chunk of the cortex secretes what. So we want to remember GFR for the order that they're in. The glomerulosa, this is always responsible for the aldosterone. Fasciculata is the cortisol. Reticularis is the DHEA. Pancreas, we already talked about the pancreas. Those are our digestive gland lectures. We got into all of that. I also included those slides here, so if you want to, you can come back and go through, all of the pancreas material. There we go. So you can go through all of the pancreas material if you so want to. If you want to, remember, the alpha cells, beta cells, delta cells, the F cells, and what gets secreted by all of those. I included those all in here. And then gonads, this is what we're going to be covering in future lectures, so we're not going to dive into it now because it's going to be coming up very soon. Finally, here at the end, these are a bunch of tables. Personally, these are for the textbook tables. I feel like they definitely give a little too much information. So if you like these, I would recommend taking all of these different tables and kind of conjoining them into one really nice, neat table that gives you, the organ, the cell type, what hormone it produces, and then shorten a lot of this function stuff just to what you need to help you remember stuff like chemical form. You don't need to remember any of the chemical form stuff. Ignore all of that. You really don't need to know percentages of total cells. Let's see what else. Again, not really concerned with the hormone structure and size. Quantity percent, not really concerned about that either. This one, absolutely love this one. I also included here at the end some of those negative feedback loops that I built. These are actually found in my Physiology 2 notes, but I dumped them in here just so you have a couple of these so you can see, these are how these feedback loops work. Just so you can start to take a peek at them and get a little bit ahead eventually. So this is in 2 trimesters, so don't get too far ahead, but this is just kind of what to look forward to in the future and reiterizing that this is some important stuff. Okay, everybody, that is the endocrine system. Hopefully you made it all the way through, and have a wonderful day, and good luck studying. I'll see you on the next one.